The police came with the news of my son's death, but he was still sleeping in my bed. The two officers stood at my door, their wet coats dripping onto the doormat, and delivered the information with professional coldness. They said a body had been found in an alley in the city center, with my documents and a photo of my son in his wallet. The face, they said, was unrecognizable. My world collapsed in a deafening silence. For a moment, the sound of the rain outside seemed to stop. I thanked them, closed the door, and leaned against it, feeling the air escape from my lungs. Grief hit me like a concrete wall. But then, a noise came from the hallway. Slow, shuffling footsteps. It was him, my son, with messy hair and eyes swollen from sleep, asking who it was at that hour. The relief was so violent that it almost knocked me over. But right after the relief, a chill ran down my spine. If my son was alive, who was the dead man? And why did he look so much like me that he fooled the police? When the officers returned, confused by my call, and saw my son standing in the living room, the case was quickly closed. A tragic case of mistaken identity, they said. A poor, nameless man who, by bad luck, had my documents, but I knew the truth. It wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. They tried to kill my son and missed their target, and they would be back to finish the job. The truth I discovered is too dark to keep to myself. If you want to follow every step of my search for answers and justice, subscribe to the channel and don't miss any details of this story. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room armchair, listening to the rain hitting the window and the ticking of the old wall clock, one of the last ones I repaired before retiring. Each tick was like a countdown. My hands, which had spent 50 years working with tiny gears and delicate springs, were shaking. But it wasn't from old age. It was from a cold, calculated anger that I hadn't felt since my wife's death. Back then, the anger was against fate, against illness, something I couldn't touch or fight. Now it was different. This threat had a face, even if I didn't know it yet. I looked at my savings, stored in a metal box at the back of the closet. The money I had saved my whole life to have a peaceful old age, to make sure my son would be okay when I was gone. Now that money had a new purpose. It was no longer for peace. It was for war. The precision I used to bring stationary machines to life would be used to dismantle someone's life. I was not a man of violence, but protecting my son changed something inside me. The patient watchmaker died that night. In his place, a hunter was born. My first step was to find out who the dead man was. The police treated him like a vagrant, an error in the system. To me, he was the first piece of the puzzle. I used some of my money to get a copy of the police report through a former client who worked as a civil servant. The man's name was Leonardo, 28 years old, the same age as my son. He lived in a small apartment on the other side of town. The address was in the report. 2 days later, I was there. The building was as gray and sad as mine, perhaps a little more worn. I knocked on the door and a young woman answered. Her eyes were red and swollen, her pale face marked by grief. Her name was Julia. She was Leonardo's girlfriend. At first, she was suspicious of me, a strange old man asking about the man she loved. But when I told her my story, when I explained that the man she was crying for had died in place of my son, the suspicion in her eyes turned into something else. It was a mixture of shock and grim understanding. We were two loose ends of the same tragedy. She wanted justice, I wanted security. Our paths were different, but our enemy was the same. We sat in her small kitchen, with 2 untouched cups of tea on the table, and the silence between us was heavy with pain and unanswered questions. Julia told me about Leonardo. He was a good man, working as an administrative assistant at a large import company. Lately, he had been worried, looking over his shoulder. He told her he had discovered something wrong in the company's accounting books. Something big. He was gathering evidence to take to the authorities. He never got the chance. His boss, a man named Marco, was known for being ruthless in business. Julia said Leonardo feared him. The name sounded in my head like the click of a gear falling into place. Marco. It was a start. It was a target. Julia handed me a small notebook where Leonardo had written things down. Names, dates, account numbers. They were confusing notes, but to my mind, trained to find patterns in complex systems, it was a map. She cried as she handed me the notebook. He just wanted to do the right thing, she said, her voice breaking. I put my hand on hers, a strange gesture for me, as I had never been a man to comfort others. The justice you want and the security I need are in the same place, I said, but we won't find them with the police. We'll have to seek them ourselves. At that moment, our alliance was sealed. She would give me the knowledge, the details of Leonardo's world. I would use my money and my methodical mind to devise the plan. The following weeks turned into a grim routine. During the day, I was the concerned father, taking care of my son, making sure he was safe, never revealing the abyss we were in. He noticed my tension, but attributed it to the shock of the police. Mistake. At night, I became someone else. I studied Leonardo's notes, cross-referenced information, researched Marco's company. I hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Ricardo, to follow Marco. I paid cash, no questions asked. The information began to come in. Photos of Marco meeting with dangerous people in abandoned docks, records of money transfers to suspicious accounts. The web was bigger than I had imagined. It wasn't just accounting fraud. It was money laundering, Smuggling. Leonardo had stumbled into a nest of snakes, and Marco was the main snake. Julia and I would meet in anonymous cafes exchanging information in whispers. She brought newspaper clippings, stories about Marco's business dealings, names of employees Leonardo had mentioned. I brought the investigators' reports. We were an unlikely duo, a young woman with a broken heart seeking revenge, and an old watchmaker protecting his only family. With each piece we put together, the picture of Marco became clearer. He was a man who built an empire on the ruins of others, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood in his way, a man who had my son killed because of a miscalculation, and I, the old watchmaker, would make sure his time was running out. My plan was taking shape, slow and precise, like the mechanism of a Swiss watch, every piece in its place, every movement calculated for the exact moment. Marco didn't know it, but his days were numbered, and the hands that would wind the final clock would be mine. The rain continued to fall on the city, washing the streets, but I knew that certain stains never come out, and I would not rest until the blood debt was paid. The plan was not born out of an impulse of anger, but out of the cold silence of my apartment, between the ticking of the clock and the constant sound of rain. The mind that had spent its entire life understanding how small pieces move in harmony to mark time was now dedicated to understanding how to dismantle a man's life. Marco would not be defeated by brute force. He would be taken apart like a faulty clock, piece by piece, until the mainspring, the source of his power, broke. Julia and I became the architects of this silent demolition. We spread Ricardo's reports and Leonardo's notes across my kitchen table. It was a chaos of names, dates, and numbers, but to me, it was a complex mechanism waiting to be understood. Julia pointed to names, telling stories that Leonardo had shared. They were disgruntled employees, betrayed suppliers, discarded lovers. Each name was a loose cog, a potential crack in Marco's machine. Ricardo, the investigator, was efficient and invisible. His reports were dry, emotionless, but full of valuable details. Marco's routine, his meetings, his vices. He had a weakness, like every man. His was arrogance. He felt untouchable, protected by his money and dangerous men. One of these men appeared frequently in Ricardo's photos, a man with a hard face and broad shoulders, who met with Marco in warehouses and dark parking lots. His name, according to Ricardo, was Sergio. He was not a businessman. He was the kind of person who solves problems that money cannot buy and the law does not allow to be sold. Sergio was the most dangerous part of Marco's machine, but every part, no matter how strong, can be used to break the machine if it is moved to the wrong place. My first move would be this: to create friction between Marco and Sergio, to turn the guard dog against its owner. I bought a prepaid cell phone at a random store in the city center, paying in cash. I wore gloves to handle it. At home, at my old workbench where I used to use delicate tweezers to adjust gold pointers, I now used the same precision to prepare my attack. I selected the best photo Ricardo had taken, Marco shaking hands with a well-known rival of Sergio's in the criminal world. The photo didn't prove anything concrete, but doubt is like rust. It starts small, but it corrodes everything from the inside. I sent the photo to a number Ricardo got, Sergio's number. I didn't write a word. The image would speak for itself, just the photo, sent from an anonymous number that would be destroyed minutes later. I felt a chill as I pressed the send button. It wasn't fear. It was the feeling of having wound up a clock that, instead of telling the time, would mark the end of someone's life. I took the phone apart, broke the chip, and threw the pieces into different trash cans around the city. No trace. The watchmaker always erases his fingerprints. While my secret war unfolded in the shadows, life inside my apartment continued, but with a tension that could be cut with a knife. My son sensed the change in me. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares. He would see me sitting in the armchair in the middle of the night, just staring out the window at the rain that never stopped. "Dad, you need to get over this," he said one night, his voice filled with a concern that broke my heart. "It was a terrible mistake by the police, but it's over now. I'm here. I'm safe." He couldn't have been more wrong. His safety was an illusion that I struggled to maintain every second. I just smiled, a tired smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You're right, son. It's just my age. I dwell on things." The lie was bitter in my mouth, but it was a necessary shield. He couldn't know that his father, an old man who repaired watches, was playing with the lives of men who killed for much less. Julia was also paying her price. Her pain was visible, but now it was mixed with a cold determination. She got a temporary job as a receptionist in an office in the same commercial building as Marco's company. It was risky, but she insisted. From there, she could observe, listen, and feel the enemy's pulse. She brought me small pieces of information that seemed useless on their own, but together formed a pattern. Hallway conversations about the pressure the company was under, rumors about a large shipment that was late, the nervousness of some managers. She was my eyes and ears inside his fortress. Our meetings in cafes became quicker, more tense. We exchanged envelopes under the table like spies in an old movie. Once she told me she saw Marco arguing loudly on the phone. He looked pale, scared. My first move was working. The rust was spreading. Confirmation came a week later, via Ricardo. Sergio was distancing himself from Marco. Their meetings had become rare and hostile. Ricardo reported seeing Sergio following Marco's car, not like a bodyguard, but like a predator. The seed of mistrust had been planted. Marco, the man who thought he was on top of the world, was now looking over his shoulder, just as Leonardo had done in his final days. The irony was cruel. I felt no joy, only a dark satisfaction, the same I felt when a complicated watch began working perfectly again in my hands. The mechanism was in motion. The gears I had put in place were turning, pushing each other toward the result I had calculated, but I knew this was only the beginning. Scaring Marco wasn't enough. He needed to be destroyed, removed from the board so that my son could live in peace. The danger, however, was getting closer and closer. One night on my way back from the market, I noticed a dark car parked across the street. It wasn't a common model in our neighborhood. There were two men inside, and they weren't talking. They were just watching my building. My blood ran cold. It could have been a coincidence, but the watchmaker in me didn't believe in coincidences. I believe in cause and effect. I climbed the stairs silently, my heart pounding against my ribs. I peeked through the crack in the curtain. The car was still there. They weren't police. They were the kind of people Marco employed. His paranoia was leading him to investigate every loose end, and I was the strangest loose end of all, the father of the boy who should be dead. That night, the living room armchair was not a lookout post. It was a trench. I held a heavy metal crowbar, wondering what I would do if the door was broken down. Cold anger gave way to a primitive fear, the fear of a father protecting his offspring. The car was gone the next morning, but the message was received. The time for subtle actions was running out. I needed to speed up the process, force the end of the game. I went back to Leonardo's diary. There were a series of notes about transfers to an overseas account with codes and references. Leonardo had marked one of them with a star. Insurance. That was it. It was his insurance policy, and now it would be my weapon. It was Marco's personal account, where he embezzled money not only from his own company, but probably from his dangerous partners like Sergio. It was time for the second move, a move that would not only create mistrust, but would set fire to the snake pit. I was going to leak that information, not to the police, who were slow and bureaucratic. I would send it directly to Sergio, proof that Marco was not only a disloyal business partner, but a thief who was stealing from his own team. The watchmaker would give the final push, and when the gears stopped turning, Marco's time would be up forever. The rain outside seemed to have thickened, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for what would come next, and so was I. The cold, familiar workbench became my headquarters. The same tools I used to bring stopped watches to life now served to plan the end of one. I picked up Leonardo's diary, the account numbers, the transfer dates, the coded references. To a layman, it was a jumble of meaningless notes. To me, it was the blueprint of a financial mechanism. I spent hours deciphering the pattern, following the flow of money as if I were following the movement of a master gear. Leonardo's insurance was not just an account. It was a safe, a systematic diversion of money that Marco stole not only from his company, but from his partners in crime. Sergio was a watchdog, but I doubt he knew his owner was stealing his food. I needed to present the evidence in a way he couldn't ignore. I went to a small copy shop several neighborhoods away, a place with no security cameras and an owner who didn't care about the faces he saw. I paid cash to use one of the old computers in the back of the store. With my hands protected by thin gloves, I accessed the internet through a public network and started digging. I used Leonardo's codes to track two of the largest transfers to Marco's secret account. The internet is a maze, but with patience and logic, any path can be found. I obtained unofficial statements, confirmations of transactions that directly linked money from a smuggling operation, which Ricardo had identified as belonging to Sergio, to Marco's personal account. I printed everything out. The sheets of paper came out of the printer hot, and they felt like they weighed a ton in my hands. They weren't just documents, they were a death sentence. I put everything in a plain brown envelope with no sender, no recipient, just the cold, silent proof of betrayal. The next step was delivery. Ricardo informed me that Sergio had a routine. Every morning he had coffee at the same place, a small, nameless establishment near the docks, a place where conversation was not welcome and no one asked questions. The next morning I was there. I wore an old coat and a hat that hid part of my face. I looked like just another old man trying to escape the rain. I sat a few tables away, ordered a tea that I didn't touch, and watched. Sergio arrived, punctual as a clock. He sat at his usual table, with his back to most people but facing the door, a habit of someone who expects trouble. He ordered his coffee and opened a newspaper on the table. My heart was beating heavily and steadily. I waited for the right moment. When the waiter was distracted and Sergio turned his head for a second to look at the rain outside, I got up. I walked slowly, like a man with joint pain, and as I passed his table, I dropped the envelope on his newspaper. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept walking toward the door and disappeared into the gray street. The whole act took no more than 10 seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. On the way home, the weight of what I had done hit me. I, a man who had spent his entire life fixing things, creating order out of the chaos of small parts, had just planted the seed of destruction. I didn't use a weapon. I didn't raise my voice. I used information as a lever to move two brute forces against each other. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were the same hands that taught my son to ride a bike, that held my wife's hand until her last breath. Now they were stained with violence that had not yet happened, but that I knew was inevitable. Part of me felt disgusted with the man I was becoming, but then the image of my son, standing in the hallway, sleepy and safe, came to mind, and the nausea gave way to an icy calm. There was no other way. The order of my world would only be restored when the disorder in theirs reached its climax. The tension at home was almost unbearable. My son tried to include me in his life, inviting me to watch a movie, telling me about his day, and I would sit next to him on the couch, smiling and nodding, while my mind was miles away, in a world of dark warehouses and dangerous men. "You seem so distant lately, Dad," he said one night, looking at me with genuine concern. "I'm worried about you." I wanted to hug him and tell him everything, to share the burden that was crushing me, but I couldn't. Knowing would put him in danger and destroy the peace I was fighting so hard to protect. "It's just fatigue, son," I lied once again. Old man stuff. He didn't seem convinced, but he let the subject drop. That night, when he went to bed, I watched him for a long time from his bedroom door. He was all I had left, and I would move heaven and earth, or hell if necessary, to keep him safe. Julia called me 2 days later. Her voice was a hurried, frightened whisper. "Something's happened," she said. "Marco didn't come to work today. His office is locked. People are saying he had a nasty fight with one of his investors last night. The wheels had turned. The mechanism was working." I asked her to step away, to get no further involved. She had done enough. "No," she replied, with a firmness that surprised me. "Leonardo started this. I want to see it through to the end." We met at a different location, a pedestrian bridge over a busy avenue where the noise of traffic drowned out our words. She told me she had overheard one of the managers talking on the phone. Apparently, Marco was missing, and Sergio was looking for him, and it didn't seem to be a friendly search. The rust I had planted had corroded the entire machine. The final confirmation came from Ricardo that same night. His report was short and to the point. There had been a violent confrontation at one of the expensive restaurants Marco frequented. Sergio had publicly cornered him, shouting about stolen money. Marco, pale and terrified, had fled. Now he was a man hunted by his own pack. He was alone, without his bodyguards, without his power. Ricardo ended the report with a crucial piece of information. Marco has a warehouse in the Port District. He usually goes there when he needs to disappear. It's his final hideout. The name of the warehouse was the same as the one Leonardo had written down in his diary, next to a date that would be 2 days from now, the day of the big shipment. Everything fell into place. Marco was cornered. He would go to the only place where he felt safe, probably to get money and flee the city. And Sergio, furious and betrayed, would go after him. The stage was set. The main pieces were moving into their final positions, just as I had predicted, but I couldn't just be a spectator. Letting one monster eliminate the other wasn't enough. There was no guarantee that the winner would not return to finish what he had started. I needed to ensure that both pieces were removed from the board permanently. Justice for Leonardo and safety for my son demanded a definitive end. At my workbench among springs and gears, I began to plan the final act. It would not be with information or manipulation. This time it would be different. I looked at my grandfather's old toolbox, stored at the back of a closet. Inside it was a heavy object, wrapped in an oilcloth, which I hadn't touched in 50 years. A remnant of a wilder time, before I became a watchmaker, before I became a father. The time for silent precision was over. The time for noise was coming, and the final ticking of Marco's clock would be the sound I myself would produce. The rain beat against the window, but I could barely hear it. The only sound in my head was the soft click of one last gear fitting perfectly into place. The oilcloth came apart in my hands, revealing the dark, cold metal underneath. It was heavier than I remembered. 50 years of peace had made my hands sensitive to the delicate touch of springs and hands, not the density of a weapon. My grandfather's tool was not a hammer or a screwdriver. It was an old, simple, functional revolver, an object made for a single, terrible purpose: to stop movement. All my life I had dedicated myself to making things work, to winding them up, to fixing broken time. Now I held the instrument that would do the opposite. The irony did not escape me, but there was no humor in it, just a coldness that crept up my arms and settled in my chest, a coldness that seemed to erase any other emotion. There was no fear, no anger, just a clear purpose, like the design of a clock mechanism in my mind. Each piece in its proper place, each movement with a predictable consequence. I spent the next 2 nights in a strange state of wakefulness. Sleep would not come. I sat at my workbench under the dim light of the lamp and cleaned the gun with the same patience I used to polish a brass gear. I used a fine oil, the same I used on the most delicate watches. I removed decades of dust, the smell of storage, until the drum mechanism turned with a soft, perfect click. The sound was familiar to me. It was the sound of a well-adjusted machine, ready to fulfill its function. During the day, I acted normally. I made breakfast for my son, and we talked about unimportant things. He didn't notice anything. To him, I was just his father, an old watchmaker whose hands trembled a little. He couldn't see the firmness that had returned to them, a firmness born not of strength but of certainty. Seeing him there, safe and oblivious to the danger that surrounded him, was all I needed. He was the mainspring of my world, and I would do anything to protect him. On the eve of the big shipment day, I called Julia. I used a payphone several blocks from home, the light rain dampening my coat. My voice sounded calm, as if I were giving instructions for repairing a wall clock. "Julia," I said, "tomorrow, stay away from everything. Don't try to call anyone. Don't look for news. After it's all over, the police may want to talk to you. Tell them the truth about Leonardo and what you found out, but about me, you don't know anything." We never spoke after that conversation on the bridge. There was a silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the distant sound of traffic. "You're going to do something dangerous, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low. "I'm going to finish what Leonardo started," I replied, "but I'm going to finish it my way. Stay safe." I hung up before she could say anything else. She had her own life to rebuild. My part was to make sure that the shadows that destroyed her life didn't get a chance to touch mine. The next morning dawned gray and damp, like every other day of that endless fall. I put on dark clothes and a heavy coat. I slipped the gun into my inside pocket, its weight against my ribs a constant reminder of what I was about to do. I left a simple note for my son on the kitchen table. "I've gone to settle an old score. I'll be back for dinner. Love, Dad." It was both a lie and the truth. I was in fact settling an old score, a blood debt that had been incurred against my family, but I didn't know if I would be back for dinner. I took the bus to the Port District, watching the city pass by the wet window. The buildings, the people with their umbrellas, everything seemed distant, as if I were already in another world. The port was a landscape of rust and concrete, containers stacked like building blocks of a forgotten giant, cranes silent as skeletons of prehistoric birds. The smell of salt and oil hung in the air. I found the warehouse Ricardo mentioned. It was a huge, anonymous structure with corrugated metal walls and tall, dirty windows. A small side door was unlocked. The mechanism continued to turn in my favor. I entered the dusty silence of the warehouse. The light streaming through the dirty windows created long streaks in the air, revealing dust particles dancing slowly. The place was cavernous, filled with stacked wooden crates and old equipment covered with tarps. I found a perfect place to wait, behind a pile of crates on an elevated walkway that ran along one of the walls. From there, I had a clear view of the large open area in the center of the warehouse, but I remained hidden in the shadows. The wait was long. The only sound was the dripping of rain somewhere on the metal roof, an irregular and melancholic ticking. Time, my old companion and adversary, seemed to drag on. In that silence, I thought of my wife, of Leonardo, of my son. It wasn't a matter of justice or revenge, not anymore. It was simpler, more primitive. It was the elimination of a threat, like a watchmaker removing a defective part that threatens to destroy the entire mechanism. It was just work, a dirty and final job. The sound of a car stopping abruptly outside broke the silence. The large metal door of the warehouse opened with a loud creak, and the gray light of day flooded the space. Marco's silhouette appeared. He rushed in, looking back every few seconds, like a frightened animal. He was carrying a small suitcase. His face was pale and he was sweating despite the cold. He ran to a corner where there was a metal cabinet, trying to open it with trembling hands. He was exactly as I had imagined, a man who had lost his pack and was now alone and desperate. A few minutes later, another car arrived, this one much noisier. Sergio entered the warehouse. He was in no hurry. His steps were heavy, full of anger. He closed the large door behind him, plunging the place back into darkness. The sound of the latch closing echoed like a sentence. "Marco." Sergio's voice was like thunder in the silent space. "I knew you'd come to your rat hole." Marco turned, terror stamped on his face. "Sergio, I can explain. The money, there was a problem, but I'll pay you back, I swear." Sergio laughed, an ugly, joyless sound. "Pay me back? You stole from me, Marco. You made a fool of me. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" He began to walk slowly toward Marco, who backed away with each step. "I built you, you nobody. I gave you power. I gave you money, and you betrayed me." The conversation continued, a litany of accusations, betrayals, and greed. They were two wolves fighting over the carcass they themselves had destroyed. Sergio talked about money, about business, about public humiliation. Marco moaned excuses, empty promises, begging for his life. It was exactly as I had predicted. One monster was about to devour the other, and I, the silent spectator, just watched the pieces move toward checkmate. Sergio finally reached Marco, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him to the ground. "It's over for you," he growled. He took something out of his pocket. It wasn't a gun, but a knife. Slower, more personal. That's when I moved. The sound of my footsteps on the metal walkway made them both look up. Their faces showed the same expression of shock and confusion. Who was that old man in the shadows? I said nothing. There was nothing to say. I was just the last cog, the final pin that would stop the machine forever. I raised the gun. My hands didn't shake. I aimed first at Sergio. He was the most dangerous, the predator at the top of the chain. He saw me. His eyes widened, but it was too late. The first sound was deafening. deafening in the silence of the warehouse, the noise I promised myself. Sergio fell without a groan. Marco looked at the body of his former partner and then at me, understanding and panic fighting in his eyes. He tried to get up, perhaps to run, perhaps to beg. The second sound joined the echo of the first, and then silence returned. A deeper silence, heavier than before. Their clock had stopped. I myself had produced the final tick. I stood there for a long moment, the gun still in my hand, the smell of gunpowder in the air. I felt nothing. No relief, no guilt, just emptiness. The machine was broken. The mechanism finally quiet. The rain continued to drum on the roof, indifferent to everything. It was time to go home. I had promised my son I would be back for dinner. I left the gun on a wooden box next to the bodies. It no longer belonged to me. It belonged to that place, to that silence. I wiped my hands on my coat, a useless gesture that cleaned nothing. I left through the same side door I had entered without looking back. The light rain had thickened a little, and the cold air from the port cleared the smell of gunpowder from my lungs. I walked through the empty streets of the port district, passing idle cranes and silent warehouses. I felt no hurry. No one was looking for me. I was invisible, an old man returning home, a ghost who had just settled his accounts with the living world. At the bus stop, I sat down on the cold metal bench. The vehicle arrived a few minutes later, almost empty. I sat at the back, near the window, and watched the city lights become a blur through the wet glass. The people getting on and off the bus didn't notice me. They were part of a world that kept turning with its own problems and joys, oblivious to the mechanism I had just stopped forever. The weight in my inside pocket was gone, but a different weight settled in my chest. It wasn't guilt. It was just the end of a cog, the end of a threat, and perhaps the end of the man I used to be. I still feel the weight of that night. What would you do if you were in my place with the police at the door and your son sleeping safely? Share your ideas and help me find a way forward. When I got home, the smell of food warmed the air. My son was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner. He smiled when he saw me, a genuine, peaceful smile, the smile of a man who had no idea that his life had been hanging by a thread, and that his father had gone to hell to cut that thread. "Dad, you're soaked," he said, taking my coat. "Where did you go in this rain?" "To take care of something old," I repeated, the lie sounding more true than I would have liked. "But it's taken care of now." He didn't insist. During dinner, he talked about his day, about a project at work, about a movie he wanted to see. I listened, nodded, responded with short sentences. I ate the food he had prepared, felt its warmth, but it was as if I were miles away, still in that cold, damp warehouse. Each bite was an effort. The sound of the cutlery on the plate seemed too loud, almost violent. "Are you okay, Dad? You seem quieter than usual," he asked, the concern in his voice a twinge in my chest. I forced a smile. "I'm just tired, son. It's been a long day." He accepted the answer, but his eyes studied me for a moment as if trying to read the pages I had torn from my own story. That night, I watched him sleep again from his bedroom door. He slept peacefully, the peace I had bought with 2 lives. The price was high, but looking at him, I knew I would pay it again without hesitation. 2 days later, the news appeared in local newspapers and on television. 2 businessmen found dead in warehouse in Port District. Police suspect a settling of scores linked to illegal activities. The report was short, impersonal. Marco and Sergio were reduced to 2 grainy photos and a few sentences about their front businesses. No mention of an old watchmaker, no mention of Leonardo. They were just 2 more names in a city full of violent stories. My son read the news over my shoulder as I drank my coffee. "How awful," he commented. "The world is getting more and more dangerous." He had no idea how close that danger had come. I just muttered in agreement, turning the page of the newspaper. For the world, the case was closed. For me, too. The sick machine had been dismantled. A week later, I used another payphone to call Julia. I needed to know if she was okay, if she had followed my instructions. She answered on the first ring, her voice cautious. "It's me," I said, without identifying myself. There was a pause. "I know," she replied. "I saw the news. The police came to talk to me. I told them everything I knew about Leonardo and the threats he received from Marco. They wrote everything down. They thought his death was connected to that he discovered something he shouldn't have." "What about me?" I asked. "I never spoke to you. I don't know any old watchmaker," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you, Julia. Now please get on with your life. Leave this behind." "I'll try," she said, and for the first time I heard something that wasn't fear or sadness in her voice. It was a kind of weary relief. "What you did, I don't know if it was right or wrong, but I know that Leonardo can finally rest, and so can I. Goodbye." She hung up. It was the last time I heard her voice. We were 2 broken pieces that came together briefly to right an injustice. Now our paths were parting forever. The following months passed slowly. Autumn gave way to a gray winter, but the endless rain finally stopped. The tension in my shoulders began to ease. A muscle that had been contracted distracted for so long that I no longer remembered what it was like to relax. Gradually, I returned to my workbench. My old customers came to me with their broken watches, and I accepted them. My hands still trembled a little, but not from anger or fear. It was just age, my old and familiar adversary. I cleaned the gears, adjusted the springs, and watched time start moving again under my fingers. But something had changed. Before, I saw beauty in precision, in the perfect order of a mechanism. Now I also saw its fragility. I knew how easy it was to stop everything with a single sudden movement. Knowledge was a shadow that sat beside me on the workbench. I had become a master not only at winding the clock, but also at knowing how to stop it. My son and I found a new rhythm. The distance that had grown between us during those dark days began to diminish. He no longer asked questions about my tiredness or my distraction. I think he simply accepted that his father was getting older, with the secrets and quirks that come with age. We watched movies together, walked in the park on the rare sunny days, and our conversations became easy and natural again. I saw him smile, I saw him make plans for the future, and in each of those moments, I felt confirmation that I had made the right choice. His peace was my absolution. I would never tell him the truth. Knowledge was a burden, and my job as a father was to carry it for him. He would live his life in the light because I had willingly walked in the shadows to erase any darkness that might touch him. One spring afternoon, months after it was all over, I was repairing an antique pocket watch. It was a delicate piece with a complex mechanism. As I adjusted a tiny spring with my tweezers, my hand slipped and the piece sprang out, falling onto the wooden floor. I bent down to look for it, and my eyes fell on my grandfather's old toolbox, stored at the back of the closet. For a moment, the image of the gun, cold and heavy, came back to my mind. The sound of gunshots echoed in the silence of my apartment. The smell of gunpowder, the emptiness, the nausea I hadn't felt at the time threatened to rise, but I pushed it down. I took a deep breath. I found the small spring on the floor, picked it up, and returned to my workbench. I put it back in place with a firmness that surprised me. The clock began to tick, a soft, steady sound. Life going on. I looked at my hands. They were the hands of a watchmaker, the hands of a father. They were the hands that had protected the only thing that mattered in the world. They were stained, I knew, but they were also the hands that ensured that my son's watch would continue to work safely, and for me that was enough to find peace. The soft ticking of the watch was the only countdown that mattered now, marking not the end, but the continuation of a life I had saved. Life, like a well-adjusted clock, found its rhythm. Winter passed, taking with it the rains and the cold that seemed to have settled in my soul. Spring arrived timidly, bringing a soft light that entered through my living room window and warmed the worn varnish of my workbench. I went back to being just a watchmaker, an old man surrounded by gears and time. The echo of the shots in the warehouse became more distant, a dissonant note in a melody that was gradually becoming harmonious again. My son and I talked more. He told me about his plans, and I listened to him with an attention I hadn't had before. Each of his laughs was confirmation that I had done the right thing. I had cleared the way for him to walk without fear, and that was my only consolation, my only peace. The hunter who was born on that rainy night was put to sleep, stored in a dark box at the back of my memory, along with the smell of gunpowder and the heavy silence of death. I believed he would stay there forever. A year passed. The city was in the midst of a hot, lazy summer. It was on a Sunday afternoon that my son came home with a different smile, a sparkle in his eyes that I hadn't seen since he was a little boy. He wasn't alone. At his side was a young woman named Camilla. She was pretty, with an easy smile and intelligent eyes that seemed to observe everything. She shook my hand firmly and called me by my first name, without any formality. During dinner, she talked about her work at an art gallery, about the books she read, and listened with genuine interest when I talked about my old watches. She seemed perfect. My son looked at her with an adoration that filled me with cautious joy. He deserved to be happy. He deserved someone who made him smile like that. As they washed the dishes together in the kitchen, laughing at some silly joke, I felt at peace. The machine of our life had gained a new part, one that seemed to fit perfectly, but a watchmaker learns to be wary of perfection. Mechanisms that are too perfect often have a hidden flaw, a spring wound to the extreme, about to snap. The first time I felt the friction was a few weeks later. Camilla was sitting on the sofa, reading a book, her bare feet resting on the coffee table. For a brief moment I saw a small tattoo on her ankle. It was a strange design, a kind of stylized knot. The image pulled me back to a dark place. I had seen that same symbol before. It was on one of the documents I had taken from Marco's business, a logo for one of his front companies. My heart skipped a beat. It could be a coincidence. The city was big, but not that big. I tried to convince myself that it was my old mistrust, the shadow of the hunter stirring in his sleep. I said nothing. I just watched, and the silence in my house which had once been peaceful, was now charged with a new and terrible question. The days that followed were silent torture. I watched Camilla, looking for other cracks in her perfect facade. She was always kind, always attentive. She brought sweets from the bakery, helped me with the shopping, and treated my son with an affection that seemed sincere. But I could no longer look at her without seeing that small mark on her ankle, a seal that connected her to the world I had tried to destroy. I felt like a traitor, spying on the woman my son loved. Every smile I gave her felt like a lie. The tension returned to my shoulders, the same weight I felt when I waited in the warehouse. The hunter was waking up, and he was hungry. He wanted to know. He needed to know. Protecting my son was a force more powerful than my own desire for peace. The confirmation came on a rainy night, almost like an echo of that other night that changed everything. My son and Camilla had gone out to the movies. I said I was tired and preferred to stay in. As soon as they left, I went to my son's room. I had never invaded his privacy, but that night I wasn't a father. I was a guard. Camilla's purse was on the chair. My hands trembled as I opened it. What did I expect to find? A gun? Evidence? Deep down I hoped to find nothing, hoped I was wrong, that I was just a foolish, paranoid old man. But between a book and a wallet, I found a second cell phone, a simple, disposable model. I turned it on. There were only a few messages exchanged with a single number saved as contact. The last message had been sent that afternoon. It said, "He still doesn't trust me. The old man watches my every move. I need more time." A chill ran through me, so intense that I had to sit down on the bed. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't paranoia. It was a plan. She wasn't there for love. She was there for something else. And the old man who watched her every move was me. They knew I existed. The initial shock gave way to the same cold, calculated anger as before. She wasn't just deceiving me. She was using my son. She was turning his love into a tool to get to me, or to what they thought I knew. Maybe they thought I had the money Marco stole from Sergio. Maybe they wanted revenge in a slower, more cruel way. It didn't matter. The threat was inside my house, sleeping in the next room, hugging my son. The mechanism was more delicate this time, more dangerous. One false move and I would destroy not only the enemy but also the heart of the person I loved most in the world. I needed to dismantle this machine without my son realizing it even existed. I put the cell phone back in the bag, exactly as it was. I wiped my fingerprints with a tissue. When they came back from the movies, laughing and wet from the rain, I greeted them with a smile. The hunter now wore the mask of a retired watchmaker. My plan began to take shape. I needed to know who the contact was. I used part of what was left of my savings to buy simple tracking equipment. Technology had advanced a lot since my time, but the principles were the same: patience, observation, and precision. I installed a small program on my home computer that copied everything that was typed, and I waited. The wait was the hardest part. I had to act normal, have dinner with them, listen to their plans for the weekend, all while knowing that the woman sitting at my table was a snake waiting to strike. A few days later, I had what I needed. Camilla used the computer to access an anonymous email account. She exchanged short messages with someone. She talked about my routine, about the trust my son placed in her, and in one of the messages, she mentioned a meeting. It would be on Friday, at a cafe across town. The contact's name was Ricardo, the same Ricardo who sold me the gun. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a sharp, terrible click. Ricardo wasn't just a gun dealer. He was part of that organization, a piece that survived the fall of Marco and Sergio, and he had sent Camilla to finish the job. On Friday, I told my son I was going to visit an old client who was ill. It was an easy lie. I took a bus and went to the neighborhood where the cafe was located. I arrived an hour early. I sat in a snack bar across the street where I could see the cafe entrance without being seen. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on. Then I saw her. Camilla arrived, looked around, and went inside. 10 minutes later, Ricardo appeared. The same tired, cynical face. They sat at a table near the window. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language was clear. She spoke urgently, gesturing. He listened, impassive, nodding his head from time to time. They didn't look like partners. They looked like a boss and his employee. He handed her an envelope and, after a few more minutes, got up and left. Camilla stayed there for a while longer, her head down, as if the weight of the world were on her shoulders. At that moment, I didn't see a villain. I saw a cog stuck in a machine she had no control over, but that didn't change the fact that she was a threat. I followed her when she left the cafe. She didn't go home. She wandered aimlessly for a while, and then entered a small park. She sat down on an empty bench, facing a dirty lake. I approached quietly and sat down at the other end of the bench. She didn't notice me right away. When she finally turned her face and saw me, the shock in her eyes was genuine. The blood drained from her face. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I could ask you the same thing," I replied, my voice calm and even. "This place is a little far from your art gallery." Silence stretched between us. She knew I knew. Her mask had fallen. "Ricardo sends his regards," I said, and that broke her. Silent tears began to roll down her face. "You don't understand," she said. "I had no choice. My father owed Sergio a lot of money. When he died, the debt passed on to me. Ricardo found me. He said that if I didn't help him find the money Marco stole, something bad would happen to my family. family. Her story was sad, but it didn't change anything. And my son? What is he in your story? Collateral damage? She shook her head. At first, yes. It was just a job, but I fell in love with him. I swear I don't want to hurt him. I believed her. The pain in her voice was real, but her love wouldn't protect him from Ricardo. You have a choice now, Camilla, I said, my voice still calm, but with the weight of steel underneath. You're going to disappear. You're going to walk out of my son's life today. You'll make up an excuse, any excuse. You'll tell Ricardo you didn't find anything, and that you ran away because you were afraid of me. You'll disappear and never come back. She looked at me, her eyes full of despair. What if I don't? I leaned in a little closer. If you don't, I'll tell my son exactly who you are and what you're doing here. I'll show him the cell phone you hide in your purse and the messages you exchange with Ricardo. I'll destroy the image he has of you, and then I'll go to Ricardo, and I'll finish the job I started in that warehouse. The choice is yours. My son's fleeting happiness or your life. She was silent for a long time, staring at the still water of the lake. I didn't threaten her with violence. I threatened her with the truth, which is sometimes a much crueler weapon. Finally, she nodded, defeated. I'm leaving, she said, her voice a whisper. That night, she broke up with my son. She said she had received a job offer in another country and needed to leave immediately. His heart broke. I held him as he cried, feeling the weight of my lie in every bone. I had saved him again, but this time, the price was his happiness. The peace I found was an illusion. The truth is that a watchmaker who learns to stop time can never again just watch it pass. He becomes its eternal guardian, a lonely and endless job. Seeing my son suffer was like swallowing ground glass. Every day a little more. The sparkle in his eyes had faded, replaced by a deep, silent sadness. He moved around the house like a ghost. The shadow of the happy young man Camilla had awakened. We sat down to dinner in heavy silence, broken only by the sound of cutlery on plates. He wouldn't look me in the eye. I didn't know if it was because of the pain or if somehow he sensed the lie that hung between us. I saved him from a bullet, but I condemned him to a wound in his soul, one that I myself had opened. At night, I heard him tossing and turning in bed in the next room. It was in those moments that the hunter inside me shrank, giving way only to the father who felt the crushing weight of his choices. Peace was a luxury I didn't deserve. I had traded his happiness for his safety, and now I lived in the purgatory I had created. The weeks dragged on, turning autumn into an early winter. The city seemed grayer, the people more hurried. I returned to my workbench, but my hands no longer found the same comfort in the gears. Every watch I repaired seemed like a mockery. I could fix other people's time, but I couldn't turn back mine to fix what had broken in my son. One day, while cleaning the window of my small home workshop, I saw a dark car parked across the street. It wasn't a common model in our neighborhood. It stayed there for an hour. The next day, it was there again. It was no coincidence. Ricardo knew Camilla had failed, and he knew, somehow, that her failure had something to do with me. The warning was no longer about my son. The warning was now for me. They were no longer hunting a random target. They were hunting me. The snake had not only been expelled from the nest, it had returned to tell its master where the nest was. That car was the click I needed. Guilt gave way to clarity. Sadness gave way to the cold anger of before. I had been reactive, parrying blows, trying to protect. Now I understood. The only way to ensure peace was to root out evil. As long as Ricardo existed, he would be a loose cog, ready to jam the whole machine of our lives at any moment. Protecting my son was no longer enough. I needed to destroy the threat once and for all. That night, I opened the metal box at the back of the closet again. The money was there, diminished, but it was still a weapon. I looked at my trembling hands. No, they weren't trembling with fear. They were trembling with anticipation. The patient watchmaker had died once. Now the guilty father was also dying. Only the hunter remained, and this time he wouldn't wait for the prey to come to him. He would track it down, corner it, and finish the job. My first step was to use the same source that had given me Leonardo's police report. It was a risk, but I didn't have many options. I paid him a good amount of money to find information about Ricardo. Full name, addresses, businesses. The information arrived 2 weeks later in a brown envelope left in my mailbox. Ricardo was smarter than Marco or Sergio. He didn't have a fixed base. He used several names and ran an import-export business as a front, but there was one address that kept coming up in the documents. An old warehouse in the port area. It was listed as a storage facility for his company. That was where the main cog of his operation must have been. I spent the next few days studying maps of the area, bus routes, blind spots. I had neither strength nor youth. My only weapon was patience, the same patience I used to find the tiny defect in a Swiss watch. Before acting, I needed to see Julia. It was a loose end in my conscience. I went to her apartment. The building seemed less sad, perhaps because the rare winter sun was shining on the facade. She answered the door and for a moment didn't recognize me. Then her eyes widened. She had changed. The pain was still there, but there was a strength that hadn't been there before. She invited me in. The small kitchen was the same, but now there were potted plants in the window. "I thought I'd never see you again," she said, pouring me a cup of tea. I told her, in a few words, that the threat was not over, that the man behind it all was still out there. "And what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice firm. "What needs to be done?" I replied. She looked at me for a long time. "Leonardo was a good man. He didn't deserve what happened. No one does. Do what you have to do. For yourself, for your son, and for him." She didn't offer to help. She just gave me her blessing, which, in a way, was all I needed. I left feeling less weight on my shoulders. I was no longer doing this just for myself. The surveillance began. For a week, I went to the port area every day. I took an early bus, wearing old work clothes so as not to attract attention. I would sit in a small cafe frequented by port workers, a place that smelled of grease and strong coffee, and watch Ricardo's warehouse. He showed up almost every day, always in the same dark car I saw on my street. He arrived around 10 and left in the late afternoon. Tough-looking men came and went. Boxes were carried in and out. It was a busy business. I wrote everything down in a small notebook. Schedules, faces, routines. I learned that on Thursdays he stayed late, often alone, to close the week's accounts. Thursday would be my day, the day I would adjust Ricardo's clock for the last time. As the date approached, something unexpected happened at home. One Saturday night, my son came home with a brochure in his hand. It was for a night photography course. "I'm thinking of signing up," he said, his voice a little more excited than I had heard in months. "It looks interesting." I looked at him, at the small glimmer of interest in his eyes, the first spark of life after so long. It was a green sprout emerging from the scorched earth. At that moment, my determination became unbreakable. Everything I was about to do, all the risk, all the darkness I was embracing, was to protect that little spark, so that he could have a future where he could worry about photography courses, not the shadows that followed him. "It's a great idea," I said, and my smile was the most sincere I had given in a long time. On Thursday night, the air was cold and damp, smelling of salt and rust from the harbor. I waited across the street, hidden in the darkness of an abandoned building. As I predicted, Ricardo's employees left one by one. Around 9 o'clock, the light in the office on the second floor of the warehouse was the only one on. His car was still parked in front. It was time. I didn't carry a gun. Noisy violence had served me well once, but this time the plan was different. I was a watchmaker. My specialty was precision, silent mechanics. I had spent the week studying the structure of the warehouse. There was an old gas pipe that ran under the office. It was deactivated according to the city records I consulted, but the connections were still there, and I had brought my tools. It took me almost an hour, working silently, with the agility that necessity gave me. With my tools, I opened the main connection outside and reconnected it to a small gas tank I had brought with me. Then I found the outlet of the pipe inside the shed, near the office wall. Gas is heavier than air. It would accumulate on the floor, rising slowly, odorless, without warning. I slowly opened the tank valve. The gas began to flow, silent, invisible, a perfect mechanism. I returned to my observation post and waited. Half an hour later, the office light went out. I saw Ricardo's silhouette coming down the stairs. He lit a cigarette. The small spark in the darkness was the last thing I saw. The explosion was muffled, contained by the metal structure of the shed. There was no big fire. Just a quick flash and the sound of metal twisting. The mechanism had worked. The clock stopped. I turned and walked to the bus stop without looking back. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady. They were the hands of a man who had secured his son's time. And that was the only peace I would ever know. The way home was long and silent. The noise of the bus seemed distant, muffled by a buzzing inside my head. The city lights passed by the window like blurs, reflections on wet glass that meant nothing to me. I felt no euphoria, no relief. I felt a cold emptiness, a frightening calm. It was the silence that comes after a clock stops working. The mechanism had fulfilled its function and now rested. I arrived home and the door opened with a familiar creak. My son was sleeping on the sofa, the television tuned to a channel showing old movies. A blanket had slipped to the floor. I picked it up and covered him carefully, the same gesture I had made countless times when he was a child. His face was serene, relaxed. The spark of life I had seen earlier seemed to have spread, warming him from within. I stood there, looking at him, the protector and the monster, all in the same old body. The smell of smoke and burnt metal was still impregnated in my clothes. I went to my room, undressed silently, and took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away not the dirt, but the feeling of what I had done. It didn't work. It would stay with me forever. The next morning, the news was in the local online newspapers. Explosion in warehouse in port area causes 1 death. Authorities investigate possible industrial accident. Ricardo's name was not mentioned. Only A businessman. His facade worked until the end. I read the article with a cup of coffee in my hands. My hands were steady. The tremor that had accompanied me for years had completely disappeared. It was as if anger and purpose had realigned something inside me, tightened a loose spring. My son walked into the kitchen, yawning. "Good morning, Dad. Did you sleep well?" The question was simple, innocent, and it weighed a ton. "I slept, son, like I haven't slept in a long time." It was a lie and the truth at the same time. I didn't sleep, but the constant alertness, the countdown in my head, had finally ceased. He picked up the photography course brochure from the table. "I think I'll go there today to sign up. Want to come with me?" The invitation hit me with the force of a punch. He was including me, pulling me back into the world of the living, the world where parents and children do normal things. "Sure," I replied, my voice a little hoarse. "It'll be great." And while he talked excitedly about lenses and light, I smiled. But inside I was building a wall, brick by brick, to hide the man I had become from him. The weeks that followed were strange. Life returned to a slow, predictable rhythm. Autumn gave way to a harsh winter, which covered the city with a thin layer of ice. My son dove headfirst into photography. He would go out with his camera and come back with his eyes shining, showing me images of empty streets at dawn, of streetlights reflected in puddles, of the quiet beauty he found in our gray city. He was finding himself again. Camilla's ghost still lingered, but it was growing weaker, a sad memory rather than an open wound. I watched him blossom and felt a mixture of pride and deep pain. Pride that he was so strong. Pain because I knew that the soil in which he flourished had been fertilized with blood and lies. I saved him, but I lost myself in the process. The watchmaker who had existed before, the man who believed in order and logic, who saw the world as a great mechanism to be understood, was dead and buried. In his place was a guardian, a man who had learned that sometimes, to fix the most important part of a machine, you have to break other parts on purpose. One day, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about the investigation into the accident at the port, which had been officially closed. Cause, gas leak and old wiring. No suspicion of foul play. Attached to the clipping was a simple note, written in a woman's careful handwriting. "Thank you." For him, it was from Julia. I don't know how she knew, or maybe she just felt it. She, like me, was a loose end from the same tragedy. That note was the final point. The cog she represented had found its resting place. I burned the note and the clipping in the kitchen sink, watching the ashes mix with the water and go down the drain. It was the last ghost being exorcised. Now, only mine remained. I returned to my workshop, to my workbench. The tools felt strange in my hands, too small and delicate. I picked up a customer's pocket watch, an old and complex model. I opened its back cover and looked at the maze of springs and gears. Before I saw beauty and order. Now I saw vulnerability. I saw how easy it was to stop it all with a single wrong move, with a single piece out of place. My son set up his first exhibition in a small gallery owned by a friend. There were 12 photos, all in black and white, portraits of our city. I went on opening night. The place was full of young people. Soft music and lively conversation. I stood in a corner, watching. My son moved among the people, explaining his work, smiling, alive. The young man who used to drag himself around the house like a shadow had disappeared. He saw me, smiled broadly, and came toward me. "So, what do you think?" I looked around, at his photos on the walls, at the life that pulsed in that place. I looked at him, at the future that opened up in his eyes. "I'm proud of you," I said, "more than you can imagine." He hugged me. It was a strong, long hug. At that moment, the weight on my shoulders seemed a little lighter. The lies, the secrets, the violence, all of that was the price. And looking at my son, happy and safe, I knew without a doubt that I would pay that price 1,000 times over. Later that night, after everyone had left, it was just the two of us in the gallery. He was putting some things away, and I was helping him in silence. He stopped in front of one of the photos. It was a picture of our building, taken from below, on a rainy night. The windows looked like tired eyes. "You know, Dad," he began without turning to me, "for a long time I hated that building. I hated the city. I hated everything. It felt like a prison." He paused, tracing the outline of the building in the photo with his finger. "But now, I don't know. I think I'm learning to see things differently, to see the light, even in the darkest places." He finally turned and looked at me. There was a maturity in his gaze that I hadn't seen before. "Thank you for standing by me, for everything." I just nodded, unable to speak, because I knew what he was talking about. He wasn't just talking about the photography course. He was talking about the darkness that almost swallowed him. And I, his father, the watchmaker, had become part of that darkness to ensure that he could find the light. I returned home that night and sat down in my armchair. The old wall clock in the living room continued its steady, constant ticking. Each sound was no longer a countdown to disaster. It was the heartbeat of the life I had protected, a normal life, a boring life, a precious life. I closed my eyes. Peace was not a feeling. It was an absence, the absence of fear. And for now, that was enough. I was a lonely guardian of my son's time, and that would be my job until my own clock stopped for good. After everything that happened, the peace I sought so much seems distant, but the truth has finally come to light. Thank you for accompanying me on this dark journey. I hope my story serves as a warning.